All right, welcome, Taylor. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So maybe let's start with you telling the audience what you do. You are a naturopathic doctor, naturopathic physician, and you have a unique toolkit because in your office, you vaccinate.
Yeah, so I'm a naturopathic doctor here in British Columbia. Only naturopathic doctors in British Columbia have the ability to vaccinate ages 5 and up, as just like pharmacists can. So it's been part of our scope for a few years now. I've been doing this for 5 years, vaccinating children, adult in my office. And, it actually started, this journey of mine I lived overseas in Singapore. And in Singapore, there are mandated vaccines in order to go to school, measles and diphtheria. And so my experience started there with families whom wanted to see if we could optimize the experience in some way, either prepare the body, for better vaccine efficacy and so forth. So that's started 8 years ago. And then moving back to Canada, and I took the Immunization Certificate to be able to administer vaccines. So that has become a really big part of my practice. Having those conversations and open conversations with parents. I have a lot of patients that vaccinate. I have a lot of patients that are hesitant. And what's very interesting, I think, is to even talk about right now about why they're hesitant and where that comes from. Because a lot of people will say hesitancy to vaccinate was born or due to naturopathic doctors. We are the reason that which parents don't vaccinate. And I'm here to say that is so untrue. The reason that parents don't vaccinate and why they're hesitant actually is largely to do with how they are treated in office by their healthcare practitioner. And this is a big reason actually is why I do this, is because I have parents who come into my office who were shamed, gaslighted, treated with disrespect, and therefore did not want to vaccinate because they never wanted to go back to their healthcare provider. So then they are searching for someone who will answer their questions. And the questions I get can be really simple. Something sure they can find online, but they don't want to turn to Google. They don't want to turn to a social media or a Facebook platform to get their answer. They want a healthcare provider, someone in office to answer their question. And so when I saw this, my experience in Singapore coming home, and vaccines can be part of it, and pediatrics is a large part of my practice. Now vaccines have become a larger part than I thought they would, as a result of creating that safe place for people to come and land and ask these questions, because they don't have anywhere else to go. Unfortunately, they have tried. They have, they're presenting with their healthcare provider with very easy questions, simple questions, maybe some a little bit more challenging, but they wanted someone which they trust to simply answer them in a very respectful way. And they're not getting that. So as a result, they became hesitant. As a result of being shamed, gaslit in office. I mean, the things that I have heard, I am ashamed and appalled by. I just didn't think that someone of that level of professionalism could speak to someone of the public that way. But that is just the truth of the matter. So I have vaccine consultations, a dedicated 1 hour for patients, for us to let's go over your questions. What is it exactly that you want to know? Oh, I want to know, can you split the MMR vaccine? You know what? That's a really good question. You can't in Canada, but hey, did you know? Oh, hi. Okay, so anyway, this is where this has been born for me. And in terms of, yes, naturopathic doctors in British Columbia have that part of their scope is to administer vaccines. I've taken it one step further as a result of seeing the care the lack of care that my patients have received. And as a result of that, hesitancy has been a huge part of it. A lot of fear to return and have conversations. I have patients in my office that are shaking because this conversation really scares them. So I've created this where, we don't get into the conversation right away. Let's talk about your child. Let's talk about your pregnancy. Let's move into it. And then we're going to start with your questions. And then we just go through the questions, whatever those questions are. A lot of them are the same. Again, a lot of them are quite simple that any healthcare practitioner could answer. But they know that the feeling of feeling safe is really important in this conversation. And if you don't feel safe, you will avoid it. You will not have that conversation. And so they don't. And if you don't have the conversation, you are therefore unwilling to go to public health and be vaccinated because your questions are not answered. And so if your questions are not answered and your healthcare provider won't answer them, then you're just going to hold off until someone does. So, that's been the journey. It has been a very interesting journey. My patients have taught me a lot around this conversation around vaccines. Now, of course, we have a new vaccine on the market, and more questions, therefore, are around this new one, which we are all still learning about. Because we are still within that phase of learning. We're still in phase 3, and we're still learning about its efficacy, its safety, its long-term efficacy. And we learn as we go. And that is the beauty or the frustration around research is you can't have the answer that you want or hoping for in that moment. You have to test it out. So that's what's happening currently. So yeah.
And ultimately, like when we say hesitancy, what we're also talking about is a lack of trust. And trust is something built, usually not through shame or gaslighting. What's an example? Like, so someone might ask, can I split up the MMR vaccine? But what's an example of like a simple question that someone got shut down for asking? And how are they shut down? Like, what is that?
Sure.
What's their experience usually like?
Right. So exactly. So it'll be something along the lines of, so can I split the MMR? Oh, you anti-vax mothers. Obviously you can't. So this is what comes out. First, you're labeled as, so even the word anti-vax, to be labeled as an anti-vax, that is actually quite traumatizing for people. And I actually wrote an article on vaccine and language within the Pulse magazine that comes out of Ontario around this, the framework of labeling people as anti-vax and how harmful that is. Because what it is for you to call someone anti-vax, particularly as a professional in healthcare, your knee-jerk reaction, you say it because you don't want the conversation to continue. You don't want to have the conversation. So therefore you will label someone as something so that you don't have to continue. And the amount of patients that have been labeled as anti-vax whom aren't is pretty, frankly, appalling. Because it's me asking a question or you asking a question does not mean you don't want to do the thing. It means you have questions. And believe it or not, to obtain informed consent here in British Columbia that has been put out by the BC CDC is a 7-part process, 7 parts. And one of those parts is the opportunity to ask questions, whatever those questions are. You are given the opportunity to do that. So I am supposed to be able to A, answer those questions, but B, give you the space to ask those questions versus trying to skirt around it, call you a name and get you back to where you should be. And that's just simply vaccinate. I mean, sure, the end goal is to vaccinate, but the journey to get there is going to be different for a lot of people. And everyone has the right to ask questions. And you as the professional should know how to answer those questions. If you don't, then you respectfully say you don't know the answer and you give them the websites or the material that which they can go to hopefully find their answer. That's how you do things. There isn't really any other way you should be doing it. So It's usually you're an anti-vax, or you're not looking on a very credible website, or clearly you're a hesitant parent, or if you don't vaccinate, you're simply just going to harm your child by not. We haven't gotten to even to the point of not vaccinating yet. We're just in the conversation of it, yet there's judgment already happening. And as a result of that judgment happening right out of the gate, parents are like, I can't obviously have a conversation, because the practitioner has this barrier around them to not allow that patient to go down the journey with them and go off and then come back. And it's just like, no, we're just going to be right here. There's no going off and having that conversation. So it's really disheartening. It's really upsetting. It's this psychological warfare that's happening with parents, because they just want an answer, deserve an answer, and somehow don't get an answer, and instead are just name called, ridiculed.
Yeah. And I mean, if you want me to do something, and I also think it's something that would be good for me, we both think it's something that would be good for me, and I ask you an innocent question about it to just gain more information, maybe just to test our bond, our therapeutic relationship, and I get attacked, it's going to breed suspicion. It's going to make me hesitant, even if I wasn't at all, even if my hesitancy was 1 or 2%, I might, because it makes me think, why do you just want me to do it without questioning?
I've just created the hesitancy in you. Exactly. It wasn't even originally there. It wasn't. Because asking questions doesn't mean you're hesitant. You're just simply asking questions. I want to ask questions about the colonoscopy you're going to give me, or the medication you're going to give me, or that B12 you're about to give me, B12 shot, or the herbal tincture you're about to make me. You, as the patient, have the right to ask questions. And if I get upset with your questions, there's something, obviously, either I don't know the answer, so now I'm going to deflect it and I'm going to get defensive because I don't actually know the answer, or I just can't be bothered to go down that road with you. I just, next. So it is, yes, you should be able to feel safe to ask any question about any medical intervention at any point. And if you can't, then perhaps that healthcare provider is not fit for you. Because if you're a person that doesn't care, you don't ask any questions, we're good. It's easy. It's really easy for the practitioner, obviously, because I just recommend XYZ, whatever it is. You don't ask questions. Great. And then we move on.
Exert your authority, essentially.
Right. Yeah. And we have assumed we have achieved informed consent as a result of that. We assume that. My biggest, so this is, and I say this to everyone, I do not care what your choice is in terms of vaccination. I don't care if you, I don't have any, and the reason I say don't care is I don't have any emotional attachment to your choice. I can't have an emotional attachment. When I have an emotional attachment to your choice, this is where then I start name calling you. I start being disrespectful because I somehow have an emotional attachment to it, but I don't. It is your choice. It is your decision. What I care about is that you never come back into my office and say, you never told me this. You never told me, and you were supposed to tell me, because you're the person that's supposed to know the answer. You have the ability to vaccinate, or you have the ability to do an IV Myers. You have the ability to give me this supplement or this antibiotic, and you never told me that. So that is where my job is to ensure that you understand to the best of your ability of what happens when you go into taking whatever it is that I have recommended or that you're about to do under my care. That is what I care about, is that I've done my job. And that is all that we really should, because we should not have an emotional attachment to your decision-making. We are the unbiased, allegedly expert, right? And whatever you're doing, you should be an expert at what you're doing. You should know the product that you're using. If it's herbal, again, if it's an antibiotic, whatever it is, you should be the expert, because they're not the expert, you are. So that's why they came to you, is for that information. So I better know what I'm talking about, and I better have all that information, or at least be able to give you where you should go to get this information. So this is why I approach this conversation, yes, and from the mindset of, people asking, what should I do? I'm like, well, I don't have an alternative vaccine schedule for you. There's a lot of people asking, what's your alternative vaccine schedule? I don't have one. The recommended vaccine schedule is the recommended vaccine schedule wherever you live. Ontario, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, the States, Dubai, Singapore, they're different all around the world. The timing is different. And so that is the recommended schedule has put in place by public health. And if you choose not to follow that, then you are on an alternative schedule by your choice. And so what it is that you want to do then? I mean, I have patients that come in, their kiddo is 5, never vaccinated. Their kiddo is 18, never vaccinated before. And so these are the moments as people are like, what are your recommended vaccine schedule? I don't have one, never will at all. There's nothing out there. It's you and me now in a room. You've come to me and you want to get vaccinated. You know what the recommended vaccine schedule is. So what are we doing? What are we doing today? And so that, and so it's in your hands as the patient, but you are to ask me those questions, and we will go through this journey now together. Because obviously someone failed you along the way, didn't answer those questions for you. And now you're here today because you were so scared and turned off when your kiddo was 2 months old, and now your kiddo is 5. But now you're here. So let's have a conversation. Yeah. And then we go through that journey together because they've just been so scarred from that experience.
And ultimately made to feel like they're a bad parent or a bad person, or they, gaslit, as you said.
Totally. So it's completely unacceptable. And I don't think any naturopathic doctor, most naturopathic doctors can't talk about vaccines unless you're in British Columbia with an immunization certificate. But naturopathic doctors across the country just basically you don't talk about it because you're not supposed to. So, so I have a lot of vaccine consultations as a result, and just, work with a lot of naturopathic doctors across the country with their patients for them to come to the conclusion of what they're going to do with their kiddos. Because they don't know where to turn to, unfortunately.
Right, which is super sad. And it sounds as though you counsel on individual vaccines, because when we think of like vaccination, it's sort of like saying supplementation. I mean, there's individual vaccines, they have individual technologies associated with them. There's individual diseases that they're protecting against. The risks of acquiring those diseases are different. And maybe you could speak a bit about that. Like, what is a vaccination?
Yeah, so a vaccine is going to either you've got ones that are live vaccines or ones that aren't live. And so the ones that aren't live will use what's called adjuvants. Typically that adjuvant will be aluminum because it stimulates the immune system to respond. And so otherwise, if you were to inject a vaccine in the arm, you've got pertussis, you've got diphtheria here, you got Hib here, pneumococcal, polio. And so if you didn't have an adjuvant, then the immune system wouldn't respond. And so aluminum has been known to be a very potent, effective adjuvant. So the immune system's like, oh, look, there's antigens here. Let's do something about it. And then you get the cascade that goes from there in terms of you've got your immune system that deals with this here and then brings it to lymph nodes where B and T cells will do something about it, make antibodies. So that is the process, the very basic process is we take an antigen, give it to the body sees it and makes an antibody so that in the future, when you see that antigen within your community, your body's like, oh yeah, I've seen that before. Right on. I'm ready and armed with my antibodies to then neutralize that antigen so it can't create harm on the body. So that is the point of it. And so the knowing how efficacious a vaccine is going to be, 2 parts, is within those clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, more so phase 1 first off, which is where you use animal models, is to see if the animal makes antibodies. Do they make antibodies? Oh, they do. Well, you can apply that then to human physiology, knowing the human will make antibodies because, a mouse or a rat is similar to a human in terms of that physiology. And then you apply it to phase 2. Do they make antibodies? Great. Phase 3, we're going to use a larger cohort of people. Usually it's a smaller cohort of humans in phase 2, larger in phase 3. Then we license that vaccine as a result of phase 3 being completed. And then we have phase 4 that happens after that, which is ongoing research in terms of, because in phase 2 and phase 3, you're using certain demographics. Typically healthy, middle-aged people will be within those phases. And then we're applying it, either it's using for children or elderly, unhealthy people. Phase 4 is where we get a lot of feedback. They get a lot of feedback in terms of how it works, and safe and effective. So with the effectiveness of getting antibodies created throughout this process, is the infection rate cases declining? Looking annually to see, oh, look, we had a decline versus last year, or what our numbers typically are around winter time. We see that those numbers have declined. That's how we know that it's effective. So we need to test it out in nature to see if it works. And so then that's how you know that it works. It's now in phase 1, they can also see if it's effective, yes, by making antibodies, but also exposure to the infection, is because you can inoculate those animals, be it monkeys or rats, with the infection and see if they get sick or not. You can do that. You can't do that to humans. You can't put them in a room and get them exposed to measles or the infection that you don't want to decrease. You put them out into the community. The wild is the community, and seeing, well, what are the infection rates, or are they positive for said infection while they're vaccinated? This is how you follow those people and see, like, oh, well, this group of people that were vaccinated, only out of 100, only 1 were, versus the other group of 100 people, 90 were. You're like, wow, that's pretty efficacious as a result. That's, this is how you build this information. So that's sort of the nuances there.
And that's how we get the efficacy numbers, right? If you have 100 people, one gets the infection and 99 don't, then it's a 99% efficacy rate, right? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So this is how you're going to determine and give those numbers. Now, statistics is really a interesting thing in itself.
Right.
As well, which you don't need to go into statistics, but yeah, I mean, we use 100 or we use 100,000, you're going to use that number to really make the math easy for you. But that's how you're going to know and be able to come to your conclusion that it's efficacious. So that's what vaccination is, really, is so that you make an antibody, so that when you see it out in the wild, your community, be it it's in Walmart or on a plane or another country, you have protection to it. It is the primary objective of vaccination is for the individual. That is the primary objective. There's a secondary objective, but the primary objective, it is for you, so that you make antibodies, so that when you get exposed, you are okay, so that you don't go to the hospital. That is the point. So it's going to be individual medicine. So this is why when you're going to go somewhere where there's other infections that aren't in Canada, you're going to get those. So when you go there, you don't get said infection. You want your kiddo to be vaccinated so that they don't get said infection, because they're like, I don't want to deal with this infection for my child. I don't want my child to have measles. I don't want my child to have pneumococcal. I don't want to have Hib. I don't want to deal with that. I don't want my child to have that. Therefore, I will get it from my child. It is individual. Medicine is what it is. It is the conventional model's way of preventative medicine. That is the preventative medicine aspect and piece. Make some antibodies, so when you see it later, you'll be okay. With that, then, the secondary objective is going to be, well, if we have a bunch of people that have antibodies, then we can't spread it as much. So then we now have created what's called herd immunity. The herd has immunity to said infection. So they're all good. So we don't have this massive outbreak, so that we don't have a bunch of people going into the hospital. But again, though, back to the primary objective, though, is so that those people have antibodies so that they don't go. So I think it's important. I sort of compartmentalize this, but it's really important to understand that it is primary medicine. You are doing this for you. You are. Is why you get vaccinated, is for you or for your child and so forth, so that you don't have to go to the hospital. I mean, the objective of vaccination is to reduce hospitalizations so that each individual person doesn't get infected
in the node. Right.
But you were doing it for you.
maybe like, so herd immunity, right? It's this idea that like a certain percentage of the population is immune. So whether that's vaccination or natural infection.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of the models were based on natural infection. When a certain percent of the population developed immunity to something, the virus or whatever the antigen was no longer able to, it couldn't find a host essentially in the community. So it
that's
was
absolutely
gone.
what it's based on. I mean, because that's how you're going to build the theory of herd immunity is based on natural immunity. I mean, you can largely based on measles, because it's something that you can really monitor, because it has a skin rash. You know that someone has measles typically because you've got some pathognomonic aspects. We got these white coblic spots in the mouth. We've got the rash. We've got the fever, then the rash. So you can basically piece it together that it's measles. Versus if it's Haemophilus influenza type B, pretty tough to know that's what you have right now unless you test for it. Pneumococcal is pretty hard to know unless you test for it. Pertussis is hard to know unless it gets to the point of being whooping cough. Then you know it's pertussis. But annually, we don't actually know whom has what. Our surveillance of these infections is actually very poor because no one tests. To be quite frank, when you have an upper respiratory tract infection, you'll go in, I have a cold and feel well. Okay, either antibiotics or go home and rest. That is the triage of dealing with infections. Unless it gets to the point of the end point of it being very problematic. Now I have pneumonia. Now I have whooping cough. Well, now we can know, okay, well, we can do some more testing now to know what exactly is causing your problem and call it such. It's from it's Streptococcus pneumonia that's causing your pneumonia, or it's pertussis. Pre that though, you can. It looks like you just have a cold, you have a cough, not feeling well. So go home and then you resolve and then you're on your way. So surveillance part, I've always been very interested pre-COVID because I have all the test kits from BC CDC. So BC Center of Disease Control, we can test for these things, these infections. Certainly it's an extra step, to swab up the nose if need to, or in the mouth. Then I have to send it. Then I get the results. Like there's certainly more work to be done, but I think it's very interesting and important to know what it is that you have. So what am I dealing with? Do we have an outbreak of pertussis? Do we have an outbreak of pneumococcal? What is it that we're dealing with here? I mean, yet some people don't want to know, but I like to know so that I perhaps can better treat that person by knowing what it is that we're dealing with. But we don't test for anything unless it's at its end point of being a problem. So,
that makes sense. Yeah. Like, with whooping cough, you might do a sputum culture when they're at the stage where they go to the hospital.
Exactly. But you don't do it beforehand. And, be it like, oh, I think they have croup. Do they have croup? Or maybe it's not croup. Maybe it's whooping cough, but we just roll through it a lot of the time. And so we are numbers for that. And so it's interesting when patients will ask me, well, what is the risk of, getting Streptococcus pneumoniae? Well, I don't know. It's, PCV13 is for 13 strains. There's over 90 different strains. But the testing surveillance of it isn't as good as one would want it to be, so that I can give you more conclusive answer, a better answer as to what your risk is. But see, that is the part of vaccination is you don't know who you're going to be around. You don't know what infection is around you. So the preventative piece is you get vaccinated to make antibodies because you don't know what's out in your community at any one time. You never do. And so that's why, pre-COVID, I suppose pre the measles outbreak here in British Columbia or, North America, we had 31 cases determined in British Columbia in 2019, is because you don't know what's around you, you get vaccinated because you don't know the person's vaccine status beside you. You don't even know if they're vaccinated, but you don't care. You go on a plane to Mexico, you don't know what their vaccine status is on the plane, or the people at your resort.
Or your healthcare
you don't know, you don't care.
Mm-hmm.
You just know that you have been vaccinated so that you are good.
Mm-hmm.
That is why you get vaccinated. And so I'm sort of harping on this point because now the narrative has, as I've seen, has changed, is you are supposed to care who's sitting beside you.
Mhm.
You want to know that person's personal healthcare history in order to either sit beside them or be around them or invite them over. And it's just this trying to dissolve this way of thinking now of, again, you got vaccinated to protect you. And because if it is as effective as they say it is,
Mhm.
then enjoy your life, enjoy it, because you actually don't know if the person did get vaccinated, if it was even effective for them, because then we can go on to the vaccine shortfalls, which is what I have gone into different lectures in terms of their genetics, their ability to seroconvert, their immune status. Is it strong enough to take that antigen to make an antibody? We don't know if, even because you've been vaccinated, do you have immunity? Do you? And we don't know that. We don't have that commercially available test. I do it with other measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, hepatitis B. I can do blood work to see if that person has titers, immunity to those things, be it naturally or vaccine. And then we know, you know what? You have immunity. You've achieved the goal. Very good. Go out. You're good. You have immunity to it.
And
so
that seems like a more meaningful measurement than whether someone has been inoculated
right.
or not, right? Like, do you actually have the immunity? And you can gain that from different ways. Like you can get that from natural immunity as well.
Right.
Exactly.
2 ways, vaccine or natural.
Right.
2.
Which is
That's it.
way more
Done.
meaningful than if someone's had a shot or not.
Right.
And
I want to know if I still have that army. So let's check
right.
and see if you got the army. Your army might be done and gone long time ago.
Which,
who
right,
knows?
Like the point of vaccination is not to get a vaccine, it's to have the immunity from the vaccine,
right.
Which is the thing that we supposedly care about, not whether someone's been injected or not. And then this idea of herd immunity, it's amongst the entire population, you know, as a whole. It's not necessarily like the person beside you on the airplane. It's not, it's you know, vaccination is individual in terms of your own personal health, but and then the population as a whole, but not so much like the airplane. Am I understanding that correctly? Like, because like you said, the person beside you on the plane, they might not have immunity even if they've been injected.
Right.
You know?
Right. I mean, the overarching name, I mean, herd immunity is, you know, you hear it a lot, and you see these little pictures that, you know, Global will put out of these dots and blue and red. And if you're not herd immunity, this is what happens, and it spreads. It's not black and white like that, though. It's not. And while they will say it is, frankly, it's not, because yes, you don't know who has immunity is the goal. You could be unvaccinated and have immunity. You could be vaccinated and not have any immunity. I mean, that is the reality of the thing of this is, and that is why we should have commercially available testing to know, do you have immunity or do you not have immunity? Because that is the ultimate goal. Have immunity, having antibodies, period. And do you or do you not? And there are shortfalls within vaccines. There are. And so, you know, based again on genetics is part of it. And I mean, even measles vaccine, they've been looking at different SNPs in terms of, if you have those SNPs, you're going to have a really hard time in making the antibody to measles. So there's about a 10% of the population actually, based on this, have a hard time making it, will have a hard time seroconvert. Interesting.
And single nucleotide polymorphism. So little like DNA sequences that
exactly.
affect how you
It's just
respond.
And so there's different ones that play into the host being able to make an antibody. And so this is why we give it the number of, it's okay if 5%, we want 95% of the herd to be vaccinated. So we have a 5% that, you know, it's okay. We allow for that buffer. But in reality, though, even if you have 95% vaccinated, we would know if you took all those people and tested them, tell me if they have immunity. But we don't have anything commercially available to look at that, to tell me, do they actually have immunity? Then we'll have a really clear number. What is the number? Maybe the number is 60, maybe the number is 70, but it's just, we say 95 with a 5%, but it is there's a lot of work involved in there. Yep. There's money involved in that to get these answers, but I think it's very important. Sure. The first step is vaccination. That's just a first step. Second step, well, do you have immunity or not?
Right. And how long does it last for?
How long does it
Another
last
big
for?
question. Yeah.
Answer that.
Mhm.
Let's do it. We're capable of doing it. Certainly, there are companies that are looking at the different aspects of the immune system to know, because there's different parts of the immune system to tell me if you're immune or not. But they're expensive, so they're not commercially available because they're quite expensive to do. Okay, well, let's fund it.
And some of these like live vaccines, like where there's more complete, you have different antigens that are being injected. A lot of vaccines induce not just antibodies, but T-cell immunity as well, is my understanding, which might be more robust. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I mean, there's different B, there's different T cells. Excuse me. And so there are ways of looking at seeing that you have immunity, but looking at all these nuances, yes, from T cell activity, B cell activity, to see if you have actually frank immunity, though, is you have to look at, and what we have available right now isn't a good way of even telling us if we have immunity. I mean, even when I look at chickenpox, because on the report will say if you have immunity via immunization or naturally acquired, it will say that, but the titer is based on naturally acquired chickenpox is what it's based on. So it's not even, so even if it says they don't have immunity and they've only been vaccinated, well, it's not even based on being vaccinated, the threshold of that. So even microbiologists at BCCDC have said to me, like, it's not even what we have still isn't very good to conclude that you have immunity. We just don't have the technology to know this yet. When I do think that perhaps, silver lining with COVID is that perhaps something will come out. Maybe someone will make these commercially available, and let's be towards COVID. But how about all the other infections that we vaccinate against? Let's revamp this whole thing and really know what the population has. When you look at what it takes to make an antibody is pretty complex, really complex, actually. It's why there's like textbooks that I have around me of trying to understand, the mechanism and the differing, how it's different with artificial immunity, which is vaccine, because it is artificial. And then you've got naturally acquired, because naturally acquired is actually a different route. Pretty much everything except tetanus or Hep B is going to be through the mouth, the nose and the mouth. That's how you acquire it. The rest is going to be through, we bypass this piece, which we have an immune system in the gut. We bypass it and go here. So are we
like shoulder? Yeah.
Shoulder or leg in children, but always pretty much it's in your shoulder. Either, yes, it's sub-Q or intramuscular. But then the sequence of events of doing this way versus this way, what is the sequence of events and what are we missing when we do through the arm? I mean, I think oral vaccines are certainly more effective, obviously, because that's how you acquire the infection is through here, either a nasal mist or through the mouth. They should all be oral, really. Yeah. They should all be oral. Makes sense, because that's how you acquire them versus tetanus, obviously, through the arm, or hepatitis B.
Right, because tetanus is usually like a puncture wound. Right. It gets in the body that way.
That's how you get tetanus, is through a puncture wound. So
and that was interesting because and you can correct me on this, but so the ability of a vaccine to protect how long antibodies last for, what types of immune cells get activated, and whether it can be transmitted depends on the vaccine technology, the type of vaccine, the condition that you're vaccinated against. So like with the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines, what I understood was that, a naturally acquired COVID infection, the lungs and the upper respiratory tract has that's where the virus is located, right? That's how it gets taken into the body. And so you have more immunity in those areas. With the vaccine, it was more systemic or more in the circulatory system, because it bypassed the respiratory system, was injected. And
and the route is going to be part of it. I mean, there's also the big piece, of course, is also that we've got mutation that's happening in terms of efficacy. But yes, just in terms of that point alone, because you aren't inoculating, the nose and the mouth as a mist would. Therefore, we breathe it in, and then we don't have those antibodies, particularly in that area, to now neutralize it. certainly some studies looking at it that it does make it there eventually. But we to know that it's efficacious is you look at cases. And so you're looking at, are you vaccinated? And do you currently have COVID? Yes, I have COVID. And so then, of course, then the next step is, well, if you hadn't been vaccinated, would you be more moderate to severe in terms of the progression of the infection, or it's just mild as a result of being vaccinated? Well, you have to compare the parties. So you have to compare the unvaccinated population, the severity of the infection in them versus the vaccinated, as you would in phase 1 with animals, you do it right now in phase 3. To conclude, from a very unbiased perspective, of course, is what this is supposed to be, is tell me, is the vaccinated population, is it more mild in them? Because that's the first thing. Is it more mild? But that's because that is also a big point too, is that while you're vaccinated, you can certainly still present with the symptoms, but perhaps you don't go to the end point of what that infection has the possibility to do to you, is you're in the mild piece, because they all have the ability to have a really horrendous endpoint, which we never want to get to. So I'm really in the mild. And so is that what's happening? Is it what's happening? So that is the information that we want to gather, is those two parties that we get to compare to.
And take into account the variants, because those present differently too, in terms
right.
of severity.
So then we've got what Alpha looks like, we've got what Delta looks like, Omicron looks like, and then you how they present, because they are presenting differently. And so what happens then in the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated, and compare. And then we know to severity progression, efficacy, that's sort of that is the biggest part of the conversation. Safety is another part of the conversation, but really the bulk of the conversation is going to be efficacy and severity and hospitalizations and so forth, from if you were to contract it naturally, versus if you're vaccinated, what's happening to you. So yeah.
And so in order to compare the two groups, we would have to test equally as well and confirm cases in the same way, which is difficult on the ground,
Sure. I mean, I'm really interested in knowing, because I don't know, because I'm not part of the research in terms of being part of a research team, and following those people that have been vaccinated. How far after are you calling them and asking them if they have had COVID or not? I don't know if that is occurring. Are people getting calls, from when they from, is that happening across the country? Do you have, so this is how, this is the efficacy piece that is really important to know, to follow. So, I know, a couple days later you get called, after you've had the vaccine, but it is about, later. What are is it going to change? Maybe they're going to do that here in, the next few months. The end point of phase 3, as I believe, is nearing the end of 2022, maybe dipping into 2023. Perhaps at that point is when they do, and they take everybody that's been and give them a call and say, well, how are you doing? Did you get COVID? How severe was it? This is then, it's a lot of work, but that's where once you're licensed, because it's not licensed right now, it's approved for use, which is completely different than being licensed. Once it's licensed, then an insert is created, which goes into the package. And then you get to look at the package insert, and you get to look at, basically it tells you phase 3 is what's on there. So then you read up on phase 3 and the findings within that. And so they put that all together. Every other vaccine though has had, you've enrolled into phase 3. And so you're very monitored. They have the numbers, and they can tell you how many people dropped out, just as like phase 2, and efficacy and adverse reactions are going to be on there. So you can read that on the vaccine insert. That's your information. Right now there's a monograph, but it's not an insert. It's just so far some information pulling from phase 2, pulling a little bit from phase 3 right now, but it's not complete. So
the phase 2 is Pfizer's study with 40,000 people, or is that also phase 3?
I believe so. I don't remember the numbers, but
like that like 6 month
right,
trial.
exactly. So that's that trial with a set number of people. And then what happened to those people within that trial? Meaning, did you get COVID or you didn't get COVID? Was there adverse reactions or no adverse? That's that. And then phase 2, it looks good. Therefore, you move to phase 3. And so that's what we're in right now.
Bigger people, but it's not typically done this way where it's just rolled out to the population.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the reason
emergency. Yeah.
Right. It's an emergency. So they're allowed to do it. Technicality though, is you would be illegal for you, or shall I say unable for you to have access to a vaccine in phase 3. You would have to enroll into it. You don't just get to have it just because you want it. No, you'd have to enroll into it like all the other ones.
And then you either get a placebo or the active.
Right, or the actual vaccine. Otherwise, you get to have it once it's licensed for use. And that's phase 4, which has been all the other ones. Unless you enrolled into it, then you get to have it. But you don't get to have it just because you want to have it. Unlike now, but it's because it's emergency order that you get to have access to it. So
so we have different mechanisms for the COVID-19 vaccines. How do they work? Like what the mRNA ones are the most common, the Pfizer, Moderna. Yeah. Do you mind just explaining a little bit just for the audience how those work? I mean, I could lay it down. You can tell me if it's right, but
well, yeah. Have I gone down this road significantly? Not really, but
just like a different mechanism, right? Like with the other ones, it's either live virus or it's the antigen with adjuvants. In this one, it's mRNA.
You've got a spike protein, and you're asking the body then to make that antigen, which then will make an antibody to that, is what's happening.
So it's a little bit like an extra step for the body.
An extra step, exactly. You're going to utilize the body to make the antigen, and then the body will make an antibody to that. So, which is just a whole different aspect. And the other ones will use the adenovirus to get it in to make then the antigen. Unlike the other ones, it is the frank antigen that you're getting. Either it's live attenuated, or you've got ones that you have to use an adjuvant to stimulate the immune system. Or live vaccines don't have adjuvants in them. They don't. So cool thing. That's a big question that other patients will ask me. Does MMR have aluminum in it? No, it doesn't. It does not. Easy. That's the answer.
Because the live ones, they stimulate your immune system. Like you get kind of like flu-like symptoms sometimes afterwards. Like there's that immune response that you feel.
And sometimes you can present with the infection itself. So this is part of the adverse reactions that come from, the BCCDC is a 3-page adverse reaction reporting system. And part of that, they've got a table that shows you which vaccine and how long after potentially you can have adverse reactions. But to the live vaccines, you can actually present with the infection. Is a possibility. Like unlike the other ones, pretty tough to show symptoms of that infection from the other ones, but the live ones,
they can. Do you mind explaining informed consent? So you mentioned there's 7 steps in BC. Ontario, it's similar. Like we have, so this is regulated by province, this idea of informed consent, I think in the legal system. What is informed consent?
Well, the informed consent, I mean, is for you as the patient to be given all the risks and the benefits. So the risks of doing a vaccine, the risks of not doing a vaccine, the benefits of doing the vaccine, and if there's any benefits of not doing the vaccine. So you're going to look at each different scenario for each of those. Are there any alternatives to that option? And with vaccination, there is no alternatives. There's a vaccine, and that's it. Side note, there's been a lot of naturopathic doctors or those, either naturopaths or within the alternative space. I don't think medical doctors, maybe, that say that there are alternatives to vaccines, such as homeopathic, and there is no such thing. I'm here to say there is no such thing. You have a vaccine, which is you have adjuvants, you have an antigen. And the vaccine will contain other things. Yes, polysorbate 80 is in there. Yes, there's neomycin in there. Some have formaldehyde. Yes, there's other things, components that make up a vaccine. And then you have homeopathy. They're 2 totally different things. Homeopathy is, you are not going to create an antibody when you use homeopathy in this realm in terms of an alternative. So there is no alternative to a vaccine. You can't take a homeopathic remedy and think, oh, I'm going to make an antibody, which will show up on, my blood work. No. So this is where, I really want to make this, I really want people to hear this, because people, I think, are still saying this. And I see this at a conferences. I saw it at a conference in 2019, the BCCDC held, as to why patients will either vaccinate, hesitate, or not vaccinate is due to being that there's an alternative. Well, there is not. So anyways, so that's, part of informed consent. Is there an alternative?
Other than getting the infection, which isn't really an alternative.
Right. Which isn't really an alternative, but I suppose it,
well,
yeah,
if you got an infection, end goal is to make antibodies, but then you take the risk of whatever.
Right, you take the risk, because that's the risk of not being vaccinated, is that you get the infection. And so then with that is part of that is, well, go through this informed consent piece with patients is, do you understand the infections that you're vaccinating against? I mean, I'll take it one step further. Is do you understand diphtheria? Do you understand measles? Do you know anything about it? Have you even heard the word before? Do you know what it could look like, present with, your kiddo or you? Like, I don't even know, is Haemophilus influenza type E, is that influenza? So that's a common question. I'm like, no, not at all. But hey, let's talk about it. What can Hib cause? What can pneumococcal cause? And so that's part of the being informed as to why you're vaccinating. What are the infections? What do they look like? What are the possibilities, and what are my risks of terms of contracting it? Where would I see this most likely, for my kiddo? Daycare. Do we have any smokers in the house? That's a risk. Do we have house crowding? Or would you live on a farm? Are you traveling? What is it that you do in your life for exposure? And I mean, this is when I have a vaccine consult. We're going to talk about your pregnancy. What was your labor? Did we have a C-section, or did we birth naturally? Were you at home or a hospital? Are you breastfeeding or not breastfeeding? Any antibiotics, any Tylenol? All of these things are going to tell me perhaps even the susceptibility of when that child is around that infection, a higher risk of the infection to be worse for your child as a result of their current state of health. And so that's an important piece to go through. Now, is that part of informed consent? It's part of it, because it is what we're leading to is your journey to then you making the decision to vaccinate as per the recommended schedule, which you have not done yet. And so, I mean, that is basically risk versus benefit,
right.
And any alternatives to that, any contraindications, so because risk and benefit really encapsulate all the things. If you do or you don't, what comes of that? And then for me to give you all of that information that comes, yes, from credible resources that you can go to. Now, what I have done, because I've few people who have made an appointment and they said, okay, well, what do I do? The recommended vaccine schedule. And so, of course, in order to have a really good, robust conversation, because I want a good conversation with people, I want you to be asking questions, but I don't know what you don't know. So this is where I made an 8-part vaccine webinar series. And I have my vaccine optimization 8-part series for people to go to. You can choose one, you can choose all. And it's about 9+ hours worth of information if you watch them all. And it all referenced with the first one about infant immunity, which is really important for people to understand, because an infant day 1 old, in terms of their immune system, is way different than a 2-year-old, because it develops. And what is that developing? And how does that play into vaccination? And so for parents to understand that piece, the second one is going to be about pregnancy and breastfeeding. The third and fourth one, I usually send people to watch those two, because it's about the bacteria and the viruses we vaccinate against. Those two. Get to know those infections, write them down, that which we vaccinate against. And so then you know, like, oh, okay, that's why we vaccinate.
And what's the risk to my child? Like, are these
what's the risk?
diseases
Yeah,
that are high risk in childhood?
Right.
Do kids tend to get worse outcomes from these diseases, like RSV?
Well, and it's for you to, and it's for you to understand the signs and symptoms and the potential, right? And so, yes, for some of these, like hepatitis B, if you contract Hep B, what's your likelihood of that leading to fulminant hepatitis? I mean, the issue, the end the endpoint that is the worst case scenario, how many lead to that? And, or, what could this look like? And so you're like, whoa, I didn't realize that that's what this infection could do to me. Right. So get to know it. The fifth, I will speak about aluminum, because a lot of people have a misconception or an understanding of aluminum that's used. A lot of people think it's the same as what we eat, and it's not. So I really want to ensure that everyone understands it's apples and oranges when you talk about aluminum in baby formula and what's in your apple versus what's in a vaccine. Because the memes that are out there are just, well, there's more aluminum in your breast, your formula than there is in a vaccine. Okay. Let's dive down this road with you on aluminum, because I think I can see there's some areas here that can help you fill you in terms of the differences of aluminum. And I spend like 45 minutes just on aluminum. So then I get into SNPs, so single nucleotide polymorphisms. But people say, well, if I have MTHFR, I can't vaccinate. So I'm like, well, really? What? I don't believe that at all. I don't see how that has any relevance actually in terms of if you're the worst case scenario is combo hetero of MTHFR. So you have 30%, functionality of that MTHFR enzyme. Really? How can you not get vaccinated just because you have that? So I look at the other ones. I think we're really missing the boat here in terms of SNPs that you should be looking at. MTHFR, for whatever reason, gets all the attention.
Right.
Shouldn't get all the attention. Yeah. It's like, thank you. You've opened the world of SNPs. All right.
Yeah.
Actually,
you're not the only SNP in the SNP world. Yeah.
Exactly. I know you were important, but you're not as important as you. For some things, you're really important. And this topic, I don't see MTHFR as that important. And so then I go into that. Then I go into safety, efficacy, what science is, because we're just like, well, in this world of vaccines, it's like, show me the science, show me the science, you're like,
which okay. I was grammarly corrected when I wrote the science. The most recent time I did it was like, do you mean to just write science?
Yeah. No, I meant to say the science.
Yeah.
So yes, I go into that, and what are the, be it, it's just sort of beyond, I mean, it's kind of beyond in a way, it is, yes, about vaccines, but it's just for you as a listener to be like, oh, like these are the most important ones. And then all the way down of how we, sometimes you'll cherry pick, you're like, what kind of research was done here? Was it just a case study, or was it actually an RCT? Like, interesting, and understanding those, those words. And then my seventh one is about how do we just simply optimize health of a child? What do we do? How do we do that? So it is beyond vaccination. It's just like, how do we help our kids thrive, and what does that look like? And then the eighth one is about how I do vaccine optimization. What does that look like? And a lot of it is going to be wrapped around language, because that is a huge bulk, as I have learned over the years around vaccination, is language. How we talk, which isn't profound, but however, it is profound, that how we talk to patients matters.
Right.
Treating people with respect.
Turns
I don't know,
out,
is missing.
It's
missing. I don't know why it's missing, but it is. So to maintain that professionalism when it comes to vaccination. And then are there any things that we can do in terms of helping with vaccine efficacy? Yes, because there are shortfalls. And so if you need an immune system, obviously, to make an antibody. So if you are suppressing your immune system, guess what? You're not going to make an antibody very well as a result, because you need that innate immune system. So the beginning piece to then activate the second piece, which is the adaptive side, is to make antibodies. So one leads to another. But if you're going to suppress this side, don't expect to make really good antibody numbers. So that's sort of this has been a journey to making these. I've done lectures in the past, and I've just sort of put it all together, because I don't know what you know. So I sometimes I send people there first. I said, look, I think you should go here first to make our conversation really worthwhile. Because if you're just going to come and say, hey, what should I do? I'm going to say, hey, the recommended vaccine schedule. So we've got an hour together.
Right.
What do you want to talk about?
And so we'll link that in the show notes, because I know I think it's vaccineoptimization.com.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Which is great. Yeah. For people to get because like you said, like an hour is way more time than people normally get in a one-to-one session. But even that, there's way more that could be covered potentially. And to give people a resource that they can go to, because we know that Dr. Google is it's a toss-up whether you get something of good quality.
And then it's just so much, and like you're trying to dissect it yourself, and what is it? And now I'm going down this rabbit hole. It's not where I wanted to go. Like my question that I originally had, now it's like lost because I didn't really know in the abyss of information. So I tried to build it so it's like segments, and then you can choose the segment that you want, but you're like, okay, infant immunity. Okay, let's just talk about viruses. Right. And let's just talk about bacteria. What is it that ones that we vaccinate in childhood is what I'm focusing on, because that's where the bulk of the vaccines occur, is in childhood. There's nothing on COVID, because when I built these, it was pre-COVID vaccine. So there's nothing around the COVID vaccine in terms of my 8-part. It will come. It'll come when when that day comes, but I haven't made anything because I want to be able to present information when we have all the information. I mean, we're just always catching up in terms of new things, what we knew 6 months ago and we know today is, a lot of new things. And so I'm just waiting for all the dust to settle and all the information to appear in terms of we're complete phase 3. Let's put it all together and have a conversation. So because I'm still learning.
Like you mentioned, like informed is the first step to the consent. And I love, and I'll reiterate what you said earlier on, that you don't really have, skin in the game in terms of whether someone consents or not. Your job is not to get someone to do something, and your job, or any of our jobs as healthcare practitioners, is not to get someone to take magnesium, change their diet. Maybe we have a preference in terms of our evaluation of what would benefit the patient, but our job is to provide informed consent, to give the information, to get the patient to say yes and want the whatever the intervention is, and not to come back later and express that they didn't understand the risks and benefits.
Exactly. Right. Informed consent does not include manipulation
or coercion.
Right. That is not what we do as healthcare providers. Anybody, whatever position they are in, we are to be a sound voice for you so that you can make a decision. So that's why, when I have a vaccine consult, you are to send in all of your questions. So then I can see, what is it you want to know about vaccines? What is it that no one told you so far? And so then let's talk about it. And so that's sort of to obtain that informed consent, should be, my son is at the window.
Yeah, I can hear my dog just like kind of like in his little cry. I don't know what he wants, but
we both at the same time.
Yeah.
So the informed consent piece should be, for me, from an unbiased, perspective. And people will ask me all the time, did you vaccinate your children? And my answer is always going to be, well, that is private information, and I don't share what I do with my own family, because I don't want to influence you in any way of what your decision would be influenced based on what I do. And that's not part of this. It's your journey. It's your decision. It's your child. It's your life. And you need to make a decision based on that information, based on what is it that you want to know. You've collected it. You've digested it and say, okay. And again, a lot of my patients, unbeknownst, I'm sure to a lot of people, vaccinate. And so we do this together, and they've come to that conclusion, and we move forward. While they hadn't for many years as a result of their experience. So,
yeah. And that's a good point too, is our status or your children's status, like there's a lot of nuance behind that decision, that process. And so it's not, it's ultimately people are asking, like, this is a common question that people will ask doctors, like, what would you do if it was your son? Or what would you do if you were me? sometimes you can get, essentially what someone's asking is, what should I do? And, using you as a reference, which the idea of individualized medicine is that we're all different and we all have different things taken into consideration. So
Well,
it's
yeah,
good.
I mean, your livelihood and what you do is going to be different than mine. So we can't really compare. If you're going to be jet setting and I'm not jet setting, I mean, that's completely different. So, if you're living at home and you never exit that house, I mean, yeah, that's going to be different than my living situation. We'll have similar risks to certain things. If we all live on a farm with tetanus in the soil, we all have similar risks. And so unless you have a massive puncture wound, yeah, you'll probably get tetanus. So your decision, if you want to then get tetanus to prevent, because if you do hurt yourself, then you got antibodies. So you are either going to take that risk of not vaccinating, or the risk of vaccinating. And what is the risk of vaccinating? So then you can go down, what are your risks? And so then there's those questions. If there is a risk, is there a risk? So I mean,
and you get that from the insert,
and get that from the insert.
Yeah.
Right. And this is why I really recommend all of you to read a vaccine insert if you never have before. Get to know the vaccine. They have inserts. They're long, but they're there. And so I have them on my website, on Dr. Taylor, so drtaylorbean.com, my vaccine section on the homepage. Go on that, and down below I have linked all the vaccine inserts. They're there. And so then all the Canadian vaccine inserts, not the US ones. We get to know those. So yeah.
Let's talk about, this is a big topic. This is something that you Instagram about a lot. You're a voice on Instagram for this very nuanced topic that's in the media right now, and that's in our society right now. This idea of vaccine mandates, and so what is a vaccine mandate, and what's the problem with a vaccine mandate?
Yeah. So yes, I do Instagram about this a lot.
Yeah.
And from the beginning, I've been very loud and very clear that I am fully 110% against mandates. And that is because it is going to take away my ability and your ability to achieve informed consent. I cannot fulfill my position, my job, and give you all the information so that you consent to it when you're mandated to do something. It takes away that ability, period. So I don't know what your risks are or your benefits are with or with not doing it. None of that even is we don't even go down that road, because you just have to do it. I mean, if I tell you some things, it doesn't, now you have the information, but at the end point, you're still doing it because you're mandated to, even though you may be at risk of, as we all know, myocarditis or pericarditis. We all know that. That is not new information. What is your risk for that? Do you have a risk for that? Will there be, what will happen to you? I don't know, but you are mandated to do it. So that's that.
You don't have a choice, ultimately.
You don't have a choice. You don't have a choice. So that's the thing here in Canada, is when it comes to vaccines, is in British Columbia, the BC CDC has been very clear in terms of vaccines is the choice of the individual. I mean, I have that somewhere, I think on one of my Instagram posts, it is the choice of the individual. So because in order to be fully informed, you then make that choice if you want to do it or not do it based on being fully informed. And so then you choose to do or not do, but you completely kibosh that ability when you pull in mandates. So, I mean, I cannot and will ever be for a mandate ever, because if it is going to harm someone, I could have avoided that harm. And as a result of it being a primary objective is for you to achieve antibodies, then you are going to do for you. And knowing that, and that if there's, said efficacy, 95% efficacy, then we know that that's going to be really efficacious for that person. I mean, number two, along this is mandating something still within phase 3. I'm still very confused about as well, because we haven't come to the conclusion yet. It hasn't been licensed yet. So to mandate something that has achieved licensure is, okay, one thing, I suppose. But when you're mandating something that is still within its clinical trial, I'm still confused as how that can be even suggested at this point. So, I mean, people say, well, you still have a choice.
Right.
Well, if you are mandated by your profession, because that's what's happening. Sure. If you don't want to go into a restaurant, or you don't want to go into the gym, yeah, you don't have to go in there. You just don't. Okay. That's one thing. So sure, you have a choice. You don't get to be part of society. But when it comes to your livelihood, your ability to make money, and you have a specific training, you've gone through school, this is your profession, this is what you do, and that job across the board is mandating you. To pivot and to do something else isn't exactly going to be an option. There isn't an option within that. And that profession isn't giving an option either. It's either you do or you don't, or goodbye. Okay, and now you're on unpaid leave forever. And so now what do you do? So that is, I mean, here in British Columbia, I'm sure many know that all licensed healthcare practitioners are to be vaccinated by March 24th, or you lose your license. So it's not as though you were, to all the nurses that were fired is, I think, horrendous. And well, I think they're hiring some back anyways that are unvaccinated, because obviously we need them. But they lost their job. They didn't lose their license. So shall we say, yes, they could pivot and do something private, and still, do house calls or whatnot. But they still have a license. Same thing with medical doctors. And they can still, let's say, work telemedicine, perhaps.
So anyways,
yes. Okay.
But we were talking, about the mandates and this idea of choice, where, I mean, it sort of depends on how we define choice. Is a choice between your job and losing a license, maintaining a license or losing a license. I mean, that it's also informed consent isn't about choice. It's not like, well, I'm not going to force you against your will to get this thing. I'm giving you information, and I'm asking for consent free from coercion and manipulation. Right. So it's a coerced choice, which would be keep your license or lose it, is not what we're talking about. We're talking about choice, which I think is something clarified, because I have
And what's very interesting is actually to hear the language that comes from nurses or the administrating staff, because I can't administer this COVID vaccine here in BC. I can't get my hands on it. It's pharmacists can, because their college, they've worked with BC healthcare and they were able to get it. However, as NDs, we don't have access to it yet. So the language that I'm hearing from those administrating will say something along the lines of, since they've been mandated to do it in that office space, will say, know that this is your choice and you are choosing to do this. It's very interesting, because it's like, I understand why you're saying that to me. I am actually being coerced to do this in order to maintain my job so I can make money, so I can put food on the table. So you are gaslighting, right? Right. You're gaslighting me already before you do it. And you're trying to like subconsciously tell me that I'm not being mandated. This is all my choice. And I don't know where is that coming from? Is it so that I don't hold you responsible if something happens to me? Why are you even bothering saying this? But that's what people are being told, that it's still their choice when they go in. You should have the ability to make money, especially within a profession that, you have achieved through your training, through your education, like a chiropractor, like a naturopathic doctor, like an RMT,
physician,
nurse, a medical doctor. I mean, a medical doctor takes, 10 years to get to that point. I took 8 to get to my point, with a huge debt as well to get there. For those that don't know, it usually costs around $200,000 plus to become a naturopathic doctor. And that number is
continuing education.
Oh yeah. And then continuing education and all those other things so you have the responsibility to pay that money back to obviously your student loan. You are obliged to pay that back. So therefore you need to work to pay that money back that you borrowed. So you need to keep working to pay that off. And if you don't pay that off and you are a licensed naturopathic doctor, or you are a licensed chiropractor, or you're a medical doctor, what is it that you're supposed to go do now?
Right.
What is it that are we supposed to pivot? Are they all supposed to pivot to become? Because we're like, well, you just pivot and go get a new job. In what? What is it exactly? A chiropractor uses their hands. They do manipulations. RMT uses their hands. You're supposed to go online. And what are you supposed to do? So this is where it's not a choice. And again, to go back to it is if you have been vaccinated, you are getting vaccinated for you. So again, you should not be concerned whom you are around, because that is why you do this, is so that you don't know what's out there. You don't know if COVID is in the air within Walmart or Costco. You don't go in there and say, have you detected the air quality in here today? I want to know parts per million if there's COVID in the air. And if there is a threshold, I'm not entering. You don't see the ridiculousness of this is why it's a primary objective is for you, so that you get vaccinated, so that you can enter your community. And if you're exposed, hey, you got an army, you got an antibody, go on your way. So this mandate piece is just, and from the before mandates even came out, it was very already very clear. And it's, I've come from those mandates too. I've already been in that piece. And so I've already sort of seen that part and seen families who are very upset of having to do something. And I don't know where this is. And this thing with mandates is it has a slippery slope to it. It really does. And I think a lot of people don't realize that while you're just mandating maybe 2 COVID vaccines, there's others that you could mandate. There's other things you could do. Flu shot. I'm sure a lot of you adults haven't had your MMR vaccine since you were age 4. Maybe you have because you went overseas. I had my last one when I was I think 25. Checked my titers and they're all there. So you are supposed to have adult vaccines for adults. Really, I think it's 3% of the population is up to date. So therefore it will be forced upon you to do these, regardless if you feel ill or maybe something happens and you're just I don't think I want to do that anymore. It won't matter. You have no choice. You must continue to do it.
Right.
So, and we haven't. And it was just so interesting is we have not had this, and all of a sudden you are. But this is where you should be showing clear evidence that there is a great need, a great need to mandate these things. Well, we have gone for so long, and we have the vaccines. Mandates don't take away your access. You can still have vaccines. You can still wear a mask. You could still be vaccinated. It doesn't take that away. So this is where it's still your choice of when you want to do it, how far apart you want to do things as well. If you're mandated, you need to do through X time by X point. You're like, yeah, but you know what? I just not feeling well. I don't want to do it right now. I'd like to wait another 2 months. It doesn't matter. You're mandated to do it. So there's so many bits to this that people aren't thinking about. So this is why mandates just stop in their tracks. And no, we will do as we have been doing. We have a high vaccine rate through childhood vaccines. Without a mandate, we have high vaccine rate. So you'd have a higher vaccine rate actually if you treated people better and didn't shame them or gaslight them. You'd actually have better vaccine rate, but that has hurt the vaccine status. So this is where I just won't ever agree to mandate.
And it's an interesting point too, because with a mandate, it's sort of more of what you were speaking of. There's this point at which it may breed hesitancy because it takes away someone's agency and their ability to have that conversation and to give their consent and to feel informed. If you just say to somebody, you have to get it, otherwise you lose your license or your job, or your kids can't participate in whatever sports. It's not necessarily going to inspire someone's trust, right? Especially if that person's hesitant. So it almost seems like it works against us. Like to force or coerce someone seems like a last resort to getting someone to do something. And certainly we could try other things like listening to people and having conversations and informing, educating.
Let's be very transparent with the evidence. Let's show me what you've seen. How, and that's the trust piece. I mean, in anything, where my risk and benefit lie, if I do something or I don't do something, what does that mean to me? If I have cervical cancer and I don't bother going in to have that checked, well, probably that's not going to be good for you. Well, you know what? I don't care. For example, I'm just going to leave it as it is. Okay, that's your choice. I shouldn't get angry at you. I know what you could do. I know that you could probably be here longer if you were to do something about it. But you just want to let nature to take its course. Okay. That's really, again, that's that zero emotional attachment as a practitioner. But always it's just, if we give people all the information, there should never be shouldn't have to convince. If something is really good, I can see that. You don't have to convince me to do anything. You don't have to coerce me. You don't have to manipulate me. You don't have to shame me into doing something, I mean, it could be any example really, but this is around public health, which is why really play on people's emotions, because it'll be like, well, if you don't do something, if you don't get vaccinated, then you could hurt this person, I don't know, in another country, on the other side of the country. No, actually, no. There is absolutely. How would you ever prove that? There is no evidence around that. B, that other person, which I will never see. C, if that person has been vaccinated, this conversation is done. That is the point of being vaccinated. So it's a real false argument. You have nothing to stand on when you say something like that, because it's me that's going to be the one that's hurt. Me, it'll be a regret on your part, my part. If you didn't, and if that's something that's your choice, you're like, well, it's my choice. Right. I just don't. Okay.
It's also like this idea of individual rights. This idea is that I can't possibly know what it's like to be you, to live in your body, to have your experiences, your history, all the considerations, the risks, whatever. And so really the best person to know what's good for you is you. You just need information to be able to make a proper decision. And this idea of the collective good, which has come up a lot in conversations, there, the obvious question is, well, who decides what's good for the collective? And is the collective not made up of individuals anyways? And so if we focus on the individual and what's good for them, and vaccination may be a perfect example of this, it's something that you do for your individual health and prevention risk reduction. So it seems like, supporting someone in their individual decision-making process is good for the collective because it's good for the individual.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, you're like,
of course.
I know we're almost at the end of the conversation, of our time, but I mean, if we were talking about mandating, it seems ridiculous. If we were talking about like mandating exercise or mandating magnesium, it would be a different conversation. Or even if I post on Instagram that I always remember my nightly magnesium before bed, it's a different thing than vaccination. Like, why is vaccination such a controversial topic? Why is it so divisive? Like, is this, what is this because of this idea of herd immunity that's been proposed?
Right. It's because if you don't do something, you have the potential of hurting someone else as a result. Your decision making hurts everybody.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the narrative is coming in around and what you're seeing. And so, I mean, Trudeau has already said it,
Right.
where we want to, this is why I've mandated in order to be on a plane or train, so that you don't have to sit beside an unvaccinated person that could put you at risk,
Mm-hmm.
the vaccinated person. So, I mean, this is where you're hearing this. And so you're being, daily, the same thing over and over again. So your subconscious is really absorbing, these same, thinking wavelengths. And so it really hits your
do your part,
emotionally,
get your shot. Yeah.
Right. Emotionally, it hits you because we are toying with your emotions.
Right.
Fear and anger is what the vaccine conversation toys with. And so we get angry at one another. We pin on one another. And, we say, oh, well, I can't hang out with you unless you're vaccinated. But I think you yourself don't really understand what you're saying, because no one's educated you as to why, you're just reiterating something that you've heard. It must be right. I don't really know why it's right, but it must be. I don't really understand how vaccination really works. Probably don't have a really good understanding of how the immune system works and all the bits to it. And it takes a lot of understanding to understand all these pieces. I've been in this for years, and still, I mean, I've just bought another immunology book to, I'm part of a working group right now. I've probably taken every single vaccine course there is, and trying to capture, everything about this, along with, and I read what the BCCDC sends me. They have a flip chart to speak to your patients about, but there's even holes within those conversations and then I will flip to what they've referenced, and it's like, but I know that paper, so who does that? Who reads the paper that you've referenced?
Right.
So it's like, yeah, but I know what's in that paper isn't really answering the question. I know what it says.
Mm-hmm.
So I know what type, it was just an opinion paper you just referenced. So, and they do, but so it's like, okay, well, there's some questions maybe you just can't answer.
Yeah.
But this is where, this conversation just really toys on our emotions, and we fear and anger is what it seems to be.
Disgust as well, another emotion. Like there's something called the behavioral immune system. Have you heard of this?
No.
Who wrote about this? It's a really good essay. Norman Doidge wrote this essay. It's like a 4-part essay, and he's trying to understand why it's such a divisive topic. And he's like, before you're in contact with an antigen, knowing that there's something in the community, the immune system, so our certain brain circuits light up that trigger emotions of disgust, fear, anger, rage, and they cause us to divide and avoid each other, especially people that we see as part of the out group. And so you think like that's a way for us to prevent becoming infected in the first place. And so that idea of like, I don't want to sit beside someone on the plane who we can create a rationale because they're not vaccinated. And like you said, we don't really understand the mechanisms of vaccination when we're saying something like that, but our behavioral immune system's kicked in, and it's creating this sense of disgust, and I don't want to be near someone, and I've classified them in some way as dirty. And it would be highly effective because you would never kind of come into contact with what you think could put you at risk of getting infected. Like if you see something gross, that's part of the behavioral immune system. Like don't touch that gross smelling, gross looking thing.
Yeah.
Because it could infect you. So that might explain, like when I read about that, I thought this might explain a lot of the energy that we're seeing around this pandemic, right? And especially when that circuit, it's not easy to disengage from it. Once it's lit up, like it keeps running. And if you turn on the news and you see reasons for that circuit to keep running, you're going to stay in that state. And so it's this other component, right? It's different from just like, oh, I don't want to sit beside someone on a plane who doesn't exercise because I want to sit beside healthy, or, you know, we all have a duty to be healthy in our society. I've heard that argument. It's like, well, yes, but this seems to go beyond that. The emotional reaction seems to go beyond knowing that someone eats donuts or smokes or doesn't exercise, right? Like it's something very emotionally charged.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And so it's, yeah, I mean, that's the language, is to play with your emotions. And I think then you have an inability to be rational.
Right.
And you don't have a rational, sound mind to just sit back and say, I wonder why they said that. Yeah. I wonder what that really means. I think it takes a lot of either a certain personality, or you have to be you're curious. You have to allow for that curiosity to be just right here. I'm always curious. And both sides of the, shall we call it, spectrum of the conversation, I will, you know, sit with them and be like, that's not right. On either side, that's not right. No, I don't see how that's correct. You need to fill me in on how that's right. And I'll catch either side, and then, or they'll teach me something, but I come in it as curious. I'm not angry. I'm not scared. I'm curious as to like, why would you say that? But I need some information around that before I can move forward. So, And
another way to sort of prevent that circuit from activating, it's interesting, is to feel protected yourself. So if you've been vaccinated and you trust that, or if you've chosen some other alternative, like, or you understand that your risk stratification is low, or you're using PPE that you feel confident in, or maybe you've already been infected and you have natural immunity, whatever, as long as that resolves the feeling of fear, then that kind of turns off the circuit. But like we said, like a lot of people, it may not turn off if there's not this confidence in the intervention. And that's interesting too, that, you know, you can be more curious if you trust in. And so maybe even part of that discussion is for someone to understand that they're protected, you know, and to feel confident in that too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to say the least.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for having this conversation. Anything you want to end off on before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I think we covered it all. You know, everyone just take a deep breath. You know, deep breath.
Listen to this twice. Check out your course. I'm going to link that, because if you're in BC, you can see Taylor 1-to-1, and if not, anyone can take your course.
Exactly. Yeah. I try to put stuff on my Instagram. I mean, obviously around what's happening currently. I have been a little bit more vocal about that. But typically, I mean, my Instagram it is basically around vaccination and immunity, and because that's what I just sort of the area of my work that is big. So I'm just sort of heavy on that. I lean heavy on that. But because I think it's clearly a conversation that a lot of us feel we can't have. And I don't understand why you can't have the conversation. So I try to create the conversation, because it's just like mental health. If you don't talk about it, and, you know, you're not going to heal from that. And so this is, for people, there's a lot of trauma around this conversation as a result of how they were, you know, treated. So I do bring light to that and give people a safe space, as one should. And so we need to be able to allow people to have a conversation, to allow them to be part of this journey and where they need to be, that's best for them.
Thank you so much, Taylor.
Yeah, you're welcome.